This week, we're talking about an amazing new small group resource from our friends at the Evangelical Alliance in the UK. I'll be talking with Joe Frost, co-director of the Being Human Project. I'm Charles Galda, president of Vision New England, and your host for the Church in Action. Joe, thanks so much for being with us.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I was going to say you are the person on the Church in Action coming from the farthest away, but I was reminded Gavin Calver, who leads the Evangelical Alliance, he was on a long time ago. So unless you're more east than where he is,
I am by about 5 miles, so I'm definitely going to claim it.
You win, you win. And so, Joe, we'll get to why we're talking to somebody from the Evangelical Alliance in the UK and stuff like that, and what the term evangelical means in the UK, because we're challenged with it. But could you give us a little bit about you?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm Joe Frost. I am, Director of Communications Engagement at the EA and co-lead of the Being Human Project. I am wife to one husband, Andy Frost, 2 young girls, Eloise and Talitha. I live in southwest London near Wimbledon, so you'll know that for the tennis. I became a Christian in a car park in Skegness, which is a very run-down seaside town in the northeast of England. When I was 19, dramatically gave my life to Jesus in that moment and haven't looked back since. He has been the constant and the adventure in my life.
That's great. That's great. Now, maybe a little bit too about the Evangelical Alliance in the UK. What is that?
Okay, so the Evangelical Alliance was birthed in 1846, so we've been going for quite a few years now. We are seeking to unite individuals, churches, and charities. There's a big charitable sector in the UK that are all committed around what our basis of faith, what it means to know and follow Jesus. So we go beyond church stream, but we're committed to the Bible. We think the Bible is the foundation and the Word of God and the blueprint for our lives and for society as a whole. We're committed to conversionism. So we think that you become a Christian because you declare your belief in Jesus. It's not something that happens because of a family that you're brought into or because you happen to live in a Christian culture, but you make a decision to follow Jesus for yourself. We're active. We think that our faith is an active thing, that there is... that we have to do what we say and what our faith compels us to. But ultimately, we're Christocentric. We're about Jesus. We're about his life, death, resurrection, and ascension, and sharing that good news with everyone we meet.
And so when I think about those things, I always talk about we are theologically evangelical. We are not politically evangelical, because it's taken on a political identity here in the US by people who have nothing to do with, would not profess any of those things, right? And so we've got our challenges around it.
Yes, for sure.
And so you don't know it, but we were formed in 1887, or I don't think you know it. We were formed in 1887, and we sent a letter to the Evangelical Alliance in the UK asking for help and advice on how we get started.
Wow.
So you are answering that letter. A former head of the Evangelical Alliance, Clive Calver, told me he's held that letter in his hand. And so I know you're just catching up on some paperwork and stuff.
Yeah. Our post system isn't always great.
So now, some of us will know some of what's going on in the UK just from following the news and travel there and business and stuff like that. But for maybe folks who haven't been or don't know it as well, what's the context in which you guys are ministering in the UK?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think there'll be lots of similarities. Again, just sort of watching over the pond and seeing what you guys are up to in terms of both your political situations and the cultural conversations, the economic space that you're operating in. Lots of similarities over here. So we had the joy that was the Brexit referendum in the mid 2016. That was a very dividing vote. So 48% voted to stay within the European Union, which is kind of like the economic and political bloc of Europe. And then 52% of the population voted to leave. So we left, and it's like a grand divorce, ripping apart so many aspects of British life and culture that had fused together. So companies that crossed state divides and national divides, political structures, legal structures, family structures, all of these things have been in a real state of flux over the last 8 years. Then just as we were starting to find our feet, obviously COVID happened. And so that caused even more turmoil and a big shock to the Western world. So there's lots of parallels with France, France and Germany and Europe, and then the US, as we sort of try and re-emerge and come back out of what happened during the COVID lockdowns and systems. And then obviously, again, we're really close to what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. And again, with Israel, Gaza. So a number of our energy supplies, our material goods, food. So Ukraine is a big supplier of wheat for Europe. So a lot of our food prices have gone up. So inflation's been quite hard. So there's lots of turmoil in our culture and in our society, all coming from different spaces. And into that, the church is kind of finding its voice. It's answering a lot of immediate needs. We have what's called food banks. I don't know if you guys have them, where people who can't really afford to keep food on the table, they can come and get food for free. Churches up and down the country are providing food banks. We've got places called warm places. So if people can't afford to heat their homes, churches are opening up. We've got loads of what we're calling social prescribing as well. So instead of going after medication, actually, how can the church provide places of welcome, walks, antidotes to loneliness? The church is really busy meeting the immediate needs of a community in crisis. And so it's feeling quite bold at the moment. It's feeling need, but equally everywhere we look, there are quite complex and deep needs within our society. So the church can pick up the slack in lots of places, but I think there's a bit of nervousness of, oh my goodness, how do we hold the whole thing together all of the time? So there's lots of prayer, there's lots of dependency, there's lots of come Lord Jesus. But yeah, it's a really interesting but quite tense space at the moment for us.
Yeah, Clive Calver would always say that New England has more in common with Old England than we do with the rest of the country, because you really did describe a lot of what America is dealing with, but New England in particular. And you talk about some of the disruption in the Being Human program, even starts before Brexit. It goes back into the financial crisis. It just feels like there's been forever crisis and change and disruption for both of our cultures, hyper secular environments.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so is that what's wrong with us that got you focused on being human?
Oh goodness, yeah. Well, I mean, everything's wrong, isn't it? Yeah, I do think that sense of perpetual crisis is exhausting but pervasive. So whether I'm talking to people who are working in the political space, trying to navigate some of the politics of our time, or financial spaces, or the charitable sector, or just the mums at the school gate trying to work out how to raise teenagers, how to juggle career and job and family life and everything else, everyone just sort of feels a little bit rabbit in headlights.
Yeah.
And we talk a little bit in the book and in the small group sources in terms of this idea there's cracks in our society. Everything feels quite fragile and quite vulnerable. Or we talk about the idea of like a Jenga tower. Do you have those toppling towers where you pull out blocks, right? And it feels as if we've been building this Jenga tower and it's getting more and more precarious and it's feeling less and less stable. And everywhere we look, it's this feeling of, if I move, what crisis domino effect am I going to set off? What's going to come tumbling down around me? Am I going to crack the ice that I'm stood on? You can mix your metaphors all over the place, but it's just feeling really unstable. So these cracks are popping up everywhere, and we're all noticing them. And I have a joy in my house at the moment, because there are lots of cracks in my house where I live. Some of them are just normal wear and tear, kids bashed into it with a scooter or something. But I also have what's called subsidence cracks. And these are deep structural cracks that are appearing because the foundations on which my house has been built are too weak. They're not strong enough to maintain the structural integrity of my house and my home. And there are cracks appearing everywhere as this building is straining and twisting to survive the environment in which it's founded on when its foundations aren't strong enough. And we use this as this metaphor for the world that we're living in. The foundations on which our culture and society are built on aren't robust enough or resilient enough to withstand some of the crises that we're experiencing. And all of them bubble up into our humanity. Who am I? How do I live? How do I relate to you? How do I operate in this world? How am I to be human? Our society builds that idea up through its foundation stories. And this post-Christian secular world that we're living in has fragmented and questioned those stories to such an extent that we're not built on anything. It's like we've built our lives on sand. And you cannot build a house on sand. The Christian story is solid rock. So we need to reinforce our foundations and find out what it means to be human, what it means to live and operate in this world, so that we don't feel the pressure of the crises around us. Instead, we can transform the crises as we bring Jesus into these spaces.
What are some examples of the Jenga pieces people are pulling out that's causing the foundation to break?
Well, so we track that through kind of the secular project that we have embarked on, at least in the Western culture, for the last 500 years or so. So 500 years ago, before the Reformation, it was almost unthinkable to consider a reality that didn't have God in it. God was just a given, and everybody built their life on the foundation that God was real. Then the secular project came in, and it's not so much that secularism is anti-God, it's more that it is pro-doubt. It puts skepticism and questioning at the heart of our engagement with the world around us. It invited us to ask empirical and objective questions, the scientific enlightenment project. And so we could doubt the existence of God. And so we question, the public square becomes this place, instead of shared belief, it becomes a place of like pulling apart and questioning. And so in the last 500 years, we've removed God from the center, the foundation point. We've pulled those blocks out. And instead, what we've done is we've replaced those blocks, not with God, but with me, with you, the center of the individual. We've moved, as Charles Taylor would talk of it, from an era of authority, God tells us how to live our lives, to an era of authenticity. I have to be true to myself. This idea that I am the center of my world. So every story becomes an individual story. I have to express myself. I need to protect myself and mine. I'm going to build my castle. I'm going to pull up the drawbridge. I'm going to hold my space, because if I don't look after me, nobody else is going to. So the central self story has again brought into question, what does it mean to be community? What does it mean to collaborate? What does it mean to sacrifice myself for the other? How do I relate to the other, the alien, the marginalized, the different? All of that has been pulled apart. And then as we start to question that, we start to question power, authority. The deconstruction movement kicks in and says we need to get rid of all the shackles, all the things that constrain us, all the normatives that were actually power and abuse, need to be all about saving myself and projecting myself into the world. So we've deconstructed God, we've deconstructed community, we've deconstructed power and reality. And so we're just left with everything stacked at the top of this Jenga tower, all the personal, individual stories, fighting it out amongst ourselves. And nobody has any credibility or ability to say, this is wrong, this is right, this is good, this is real, this is true. Because at the heart of everything is this question of, yeah, but how do you know? So you can't trust anything.
And we don't, and I know you're not anti-science when you're making your comment about science, but we're fooling ourselves if we think science can answer everything, as I think what you're getting to is, we have a board member who talks about he's a scientist, but he talks about scientism.
Yes.
And right. And science can't answer everything.
Well, science at its heart wants to ask questions. Why? How? What? These are great questions. It's how we explore our world. Kids, you just need to spend 5 minutes with a 3-year-old to know that their only question in life is why.
Yeah.
Why? And it's wonderful.
Ours expanded to why not?
Well, I mean, fair. And there is the human trajectory right there. But it's exactly that. And it's beautiful. It's curiosity. It's engagement in the world. But it is still a closed system. How was that system built? And on what is that system founded upon? Science needs to be built on something. It is not capable of constructing the building in of itself. Yeah. It asks the question, what are we in? Not why are we building it?
Yeah. Right. I can't, every time I see an article that says, science has proved God does or doesn't exist, I'm like, it's not equipped to do that. And of course, then you can add in, and it can't tell us why we think paintings are beautiful that are beautiful. And right. So it can't answer beauty. It can't answer love. It's just, right. There's stuff it's really helpful for that's helped us understand so much. And of course, and I don't know if you guys have this in the UK, but then we twist science to our own means, right? People who are not scientists, or some who are, who use it, and pull out more building blocks in doing it, right? So, and fundamental things like who's a man, who's a woman, right? We're pulling these out, and would you agree that some of us just can't operate in that world where nothing is clear, and there's no guardrails for everything. Everything is up for grabs. And I wonder how much that plays into a lot of the anxiety issues we see, the depression issues we see, the discouragement, the loneliness. Is just, humans aren't made to operate in that. Does that sound like I'm directionally correct?
Well, it certainly resonates with my experience. I mean, so my namesake, anyone who saw my name in this for this episode may be wondering whether or not I'm super nanny. I am not, but I agree with a lot of what she comes out with, because actually she talks about the need for a kid to flourish in a home. They need boundaries. They need to know these are the rules of the game. And it's a bit of a twee analogy, but imagine you're playing American football. Because it's American, in my world, football, you actually kick the ball. So American football is a game. But if I came over and said, we're playing a game of football, and you think we're playing American football, but I think we're playing soccer, we're going to have a very complicated game where both of us are going to get pretty annoyed with each other because we're playing by different rules. The rules are what makes the fun work, right? They give you the size of the pitch. They tell you how you're going to win, how you're going to lose, how do you engage. And it's almost as if not only are we trying to exchange American footballs for soccer balls, but then we're throwing in ping pong balls and tennis balls. And then we just throw in a fishing rod and a computer just for the fun of it, assuming that that's what freedom is. But actually bounded freedom to operate and flourish within the bounds of reality, give us security, they give us comfort, but they also tell us, what could we innovate? What could we progress? What could we dream or imagine? If everything's up for grabs, actually, the philosophers of the existential movement called it a terrible freedom, because it's actually quite paralyzing when everything's up for grabs, when nothing is real, when you can make anything up that you want. Actually doesn't cause us to flourish. It causes us to retreat and to find a huge depression. And I think we're seeing that more and more.
Yeah. And the deconstructionist movement, which is prevalent in so many places, do deconstructionists have something they want to replace it with, or is it just tear it down?
I think that's a great question. I think the reconstruction narrative is kicking back in because the abandonment that people feel when they've torn down some of their power structures. And let's not kid ourselves. Some of the deconstruction program is really good and really healthy. I still remember when a friend of mine had a crisis of faith, and she was like, I just don't believe in God anymore. And I was like, thank goodness for that, because your God was horrible. I was delighted. The faith that she deconstructed really needed some work. But then to be left in this sort of pool pit of nothingness and hopelessness and despair and despondency, that is not the gospel. And that is not what Jesus did when he came and he offered us life in all its fullness. He said, I will rebuild the temple. And actually, we have to be aware of what is it in Babel? What is it in our power structures? What is it in our own futility that we have built up that God is really up for tearing down too? But actually, what does it mean to see his kingdom come and the rebuilding of the garden temple, the cosmos temple of his kingdom, of it, the fullness of God manifest in our world? What does it mean to rebuild that? And I think lots of people who engage in the deconstruction narrative of our world are really looking for the authentic truth and reality that actually only the gospel can bring.
And so now you guys have waded into this with a book called Being Human, a small group curriculum, Being Human, that's videos that are then intended to be discussion, and there's resources, workbooks to help people through that. One of the things you start with, though, is you use the term, we sometimes are using a half gospel or even a quarter gospel. And so what do you mean by a half gospel?
So we've just spent loads of time, haven't we, now just chatting about all the awfulness of some of the stories that our culture are living in, and the poverty of some of the stories that we are surrounded in, and we're trying to make sense of who we are and the world around us. And I genuinely, I've given my life to the story of God that we find in the pages of the Bible. I think it is true. I think it is rich. I think it is honest. I think it is beautiful. And I think it is profound. It is the solid rock on which we can build our lives and our stories. But us Christians haven't always been very good at telling the depth and the fullness of the God story found in the pages of the Bible. And at least, again, in my experience, what we've often found is in order to make our story really simple and accessible to understand, we've simplified it. And we've simplified it so much that we've condensed it. We start our story in Genesis 3 with a problem. We're sinners. So we have fallen short of the glory of God. We have failed to accept our mandate as God's image bearers. We are sinners. Problem. Solution, Jesus comes to save us. So Jesus, we skip straight ahead to the Gospels. Jesus turns up as the God incarnate, the God-man come to forgive us our sins, to trade places with us, to take on the wrath of God, die on a cross, resurrection, defeating death, absolving us of our sin so that we can go to heaven when we die and be reunited with God. The small gospel.
Yeah.
The problem is that that is not the fullness of the Christian story, because our story does not start in Genesis 3. It starts in Genesis 1. It starts with a good creation. It starts with man and woman bearing God's image, mandated to go out into the world and further the coming of God's kingdom out through all creation. That's where we start. We start with a good world and a good God. So it answers this longing and this need that why isn't the world as we want it to be? What is this hunger? What is this despondency? Why is there suffering? It's because we are rebelling against the world that we are in and longing for the world that we were created for. We have to start in Genesis 1. Otherwise, we've got nothing to hope for and nothing to explain what we long about. Then we get to the fall. We recognize who we are absent from God and independent from God. We start to recognize what it is to not bear his image, to diminish his likeness, to not represent him out into the world. We start to see the futility of man coming back into relationship and just how fickle we are throughout the Old Testament. And then we come to see that through Jesus, not only is there a reconciliation offer, the good news, but there is also a reconstruction and a restoration of all of creation: climate, economics, education, family, health, body, reality. All of these things come under the lordship of Jesus. If we don't tell the fullness of our story, it carries just as many cracks and just as many gaping holes as any of the other cultural stories that surround us. We have to go back to the fullness of who God is and who he invites us to be with him.
To hear the rest of this interview, join us next week. Thanks so much for listening, and God bless you.